very much. So welcome to today's session. I just want to introduce people who are taking part in the session today. I'm Lee Horton. You've got 3 names on your screen there. I'm a careers consultant with the university. Laura, do you just want to say hi as well to everyone? You're a careers advisor, aren't you?
Yes. So good morning, everybody. As Lee said, my name's Laura. I'm one of your central careers advisors here at the university. I did start my career off as a secondary teacher, though, so hopefully I'll be around for some of the Q&A should I be helpful for it.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Claire, do you want to do a quick introduction? Dr. Claire Ellison.
Hi everyone, I'm Claire. I'm currently working as a teaching fellow under the C School, so I teach biochemistry and pharmacology. I was just saying to Lee before, in previous roles, I was also a secondary high school teacher for maths. So again, if you've got any more practical questions later on about kind of the day-to-day workings of a teacher, I'm sure Laura and myself will be happy to answer that.
Thanks very much, everyone. So before we begin this session now, what I'd love people to do, and you could just use the chat to do it, please, if you could do it. If you could give me an idea in the chat whether you're interested in early years, primary, secondary, FE, HE, just give me a sense in a couple of words, as some other people have done already, about where your interest might lie. It's just useful for me to get a sense of where the focus and interest in people taking part in the session might be. So just whenever you get a moment, just pop it into the chat and let me know whether it's secondary, biology, or primary, or FE that your interest might be in, and it just helped me to kind of tailor my delivery a little bit to the audience. So without any further ado, let's sort of dive into the session. I think that's a good place to start. So what we're going to cover today is quite a lot. That's the easiest way to put it. But what we're going to do is a lot, but we're not going to do a really deep dive necessarily into each of these different areas, because teaching and routes into teaching is not that complex when you're only considering a small aspect of it. So for example, if you're interested in becoming an FE lecturer, it's not that difficult to do the research into how you become an FE lecturer, work out the training routes, and then obviously start with your applications. But actually, a session that covers all of those different areas, as I've got on the screen there, it's not possible to go into everything in great depth. So what we're going to be doing is a sort of light touch on each of these different things you can see on the screen there from the session. And what we're going to be doing is pointing you towards where you can find more in-depth information and a little bit of light reading in the first instance. So that's going to be the kind of format of the session, a kind of light touch, a Q&A at the end. If you've got any real burning questions, you know, I'm absolutely fine for people to use the mic. I'm absolutely fine for people to use the chat, whatever works. So, you know, if you do want to pick up on something I'm saying, or just question me about it or clarify it, feel free to share it out at the time. Otherwise, we'll save up the questions for the end for a Q&A session, as Claire mentioned a little bit earlier. So yeah, you can see there the things we're going to cover, and it's that real breadth, really, from early years right through to sort of FE. I'm not proposing to cover HE in this session today, but we have got a Q&A later on. So if there are particular questions about HE lecturing, more than happy to deal with that within the Q&A space at the end. We're going to also cover something called subject knowledge enhancement courses, but don't worry, we're going to be explaining what those are, the application process and funding. So a lot to get through. Hope you're going to find it useful. And if you're not able to take everything in, as we're going through the slides, we're pointing you into lots of other sources of information as we're going. So I want to start off with why become a teacher. So could I ask people in the chat, for those people who obviously taken the trouble to take part in this session, can somebody just give me some reasons to become a teacher? So I'll just give you 30 seconds or so just to type, you know, 1 or 2 words into the chat, if you could do, just to give me a reason why, you know, you might be motivated to become a teacher. Okay, thank you, Nicola. So wanting to make a difference to education. And obviously, Nicola, we managed to have a little chat earlier on, didn't we? And I know you have got some sort of teaching experience in a different age range than you now want to do. But thanks very much. To inspire people, thank you, Oliver. To share your knowledge, yeah, and your passion towards a particular subject area. Thank you, Laura. And Laura, obviously, you were a teacher as well, so I'm glad that you had that that desire to do that. Any other shout outs why somebody might become a teacher? Nobody said some of the ones. There are lots of reasons. Yeah, students from different background. Okay, I'll throw a few out there, just that come up in conversations I have with students. A lot of people say, it's a stable job. I might have done a degree, say, for example, in a creative industry where my future might be freelancing, self-employment. But if I teach in that subject, for example, then I've got a sort of regular, sort of stable job, potentially permanent contract. So that's one of the reasons. It's not one of the central reasons. You can go anywhere in the world. Thank you, Claire. That's certainly a reason. So that flexibility, related careers to teaching. So lots of people start off in teaching, but then might end up being an HE lecturer, or might end up working in other countries, or they might end up in a related education field that's not directly teaching or into management. Any other quick shout outs on why teaching? Okay, let's have a quick look. So, okay, there's no perfect definition of it, but these are just possible reasons that somebody might become a teacher. Some of the ones have already been mentioned. And just as a style, there's going to be quite a few texts on the screen. I'm generally going to be reading the kind of bits which are in bold, because those are the bits that I'm trying to focus on in terms of delivery, but to inspire and educate. To learn, to help people, watching people learn, and the pleasure that comes and the satisfaction from that. And as I mentioned myself earlier on, job security, competitive salary, holidays. Nobody said, the school holidays, as a motivation for becoming a teacher. But it must be in there somewhere within that picture. A 38-week delivery year out of 52. So that is potentially one of the aspects. So you all have our own individual reasons, but it's just to start the session with a little bit of thought about that, really. So what I'm going to ask you again now, I won't be doing it won't be a Q&A all the way through, but I just want to get people thinking at the start of the session is, can we have just a quick think now what skills you might actually need to be a teacher? So what stuff do you need to be good at to be a teacher? Think about that teacher that you had at school. Think about somebody who inspired you, that made you want to learn. So just think about that skill set now for a moment, on what you might need to be good at. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, enthusiastic. Some people are good to listen to, and you're motivated and they're interested and have a great speaking style. Other people, not so much. Yeah, and good communication certainly links in with that. Thank you, Adam. Yeah, social skills, empathy. Some great suggestions here. Patience and creativity. Thank you, Laura. Any other skills that people think? Okay. Organization. Thanks very much. One of the overlooked ones, I think, sometimes, time management, yeah, organization, listening skills. I think there's a lot sort of behind the scenes, if you like, that goes into how that teacher appears in the classroom, that organization, that lesson planning, that preparation in simple terms, and that research into something that they've got to deliver to you. So, those are a skill set sort of behind that, classroom management skills. But let's have a look at, some examples again of things that you might be need to be good at, if you like, if you're a teacher. So yeah, we've got quite a few of these. Enthusiastic, depth of knowledge. Okay, didn't quite come up, but yeah, relevant to the curriculum that you're going to teach. So if you're going to be teaching geography, you've got to have, a certain level of awareness of geography to be able to teach that subject, or at least be able to teach yourself it to the level to match to that curriculum. Ability to relate to parents, confidence. Organization was mentioned, resilience, having a bad day, but then still going in the day afterwards and reflecting and thinking, well, what could be done a little bit differently? You know, difficult times sometimes, difficult pupils. You know, resilience is certainly a factor, and conflict kind of links in with that point. You know, integrity. You know, can people trust you? Do you do what you say you will do when you say, I will come back to you within this time frame, that, you know, I'm gonna, you know, do this, and people respect and have that kind of integrity for you. And I put a good sense of humor at the bottom there, because, you know, it has to be used very carefully within teaching. But, you know, I think we can all think of someone who was quite inspiring as a teacher, who we were kind of almost hanging off the words of. And maybe they did have a sense of humor that appealed to us, but, you know, not without risk, that one. But, you know, I do think that, you know, that is something that makes people sometimes quite engaging. Okay, so I just put a slide up there before I plan to do. So again, just a quick question for people. And then I'll move more into delivering a little bit more away from questions. Can we just have a quick think what we know about different types of schools? And I did actually slightly put, if everybody did manage to have a quick look at that next slide, they might have got one or two of the answers. But just as a general sense, are we aware of any of the different types of schools that are out there? Yeah, so state and private, there's certainly the most obvious distinction. Yeah, academies. Yeah, thanks very much. Any other quick shout outs? I'll put it on the screen in a second. Yeah, so specialist schools, grammar schools, independent schools, academies, free schools. So that's another kind of distinctive term, which as far as I remember, free schools are effectively academies, but it's the manner and way they've been set up, but they're kind of funded in the same way, I believe, as an academy. Okay, but yeah, you've got it all there from the list that we've collectively pretty much got what's on this next slide there. So academies and free schools, maintained schools which are funded through the local authority, grammar schools funded by the local authority but use selective means to decide which pupils are able to attend based on ability, so often known as the 11+ exam. And then you've got the independent sector. So what I want to do, the reason I've put this slide up right early on in the presentation is because there is complexity within some teaching and teaching routes. And I think sometimes you have to start with the basics, which is there's complexity sometimes in teaching routes because you've actually got different schools. And different schools are able to do things differently, which means they're able to recruit staff in different ways with different levels of qualifications. Some have got less flexibility. For example, a maintained school by the local authority has got to follow national curriculum, whereas others, such as an independent school, is exempt from the national curriculum. So because there are different types of schools, there are different criteria that they apply to what would be a good teacher, and that teacher being a good fit to their school. So just keep this in mind while we're talking about teaching routes and the qualifications, because it just might make a little bit of sense of why things are a bit different in different contexts, and that's because there are different schools. So I'm just going to ask a really simple question just to get people thinking to the audience now. Do you need to have a teaching qualification to be a teacher in all of those schools that I've put on the screen? So it's a yes or no answer. I'll just await what people think. I've got an answer already. I won't give you the answer just yet. Okay, so most people have gone no. We'll come back to that later on and explain you know, whether that is a yes or a no answer. Like most things, it's a kind of depends one. So let's start with the basics then. So you've got different types of schools, but you've also got different age ranges that you can teach in. And dependent on the age range that you want to teach, there will be differences in the qualifications that you need to obtain. And that's going to form the basis now for a lot of the presentation this morning. By the way, I've put Key Stage 5. As far as I'm concerned, there is no such thing actually as Key Stage 5, which is why I put the asterisk next to it. It's really a terminology for post-compulsory education, but it is sometimes referred to in a sort of slang way as Key Stage 5. It's the post-compulsory education, so the kind of FE or sixth form age range, but it just makes more sense on that particular graph to show it through those different levels. So let's start off with the basics of the entry requirements. So for teacher training, if you decide that you want to become a teacher and you're going to do a qualification, you need, generally speaking, a 2-2 or above. And you need to do a subject which is relevant to what you need to teach. So this is a complex area that I probably don't have time to bottom out completely during the delivery part of it, but would be open to taking questions of about later on in the Q&A. But in simple terms, your degree needs to map across to enough to the subject that you want to teach. So for example, if somebody studied accounts, there might be enough mathematical content within their accounting degree to map over to the national curriculum content to teach maths within a secondary school. That's just one example. Okay, or if you've done obviously a science subject, there must be enough science within your degree, which, you know, if it's a BSc, there usually would be, to map over to, say, for example, teach at GCSE science level. If there isn't enough linkage between your degree and the subject that you want to teach, it is possible to do something called a subject knowledge enhancement course, which I'm going to talk about a bit later on. So if you've done an arts degree, if you've done a science degree, but you want to study arts, or teach arts or geography, and there isn't that natural linkage, it's possible to do it through doing a subject knowledge enhancement course, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. You do need to be mindful of your GCSE grades as well. Okay, thank you very much, Claire. It would be good because SKEs or subject knowledge enhancement courses do create quite a lot of questions, because it's really it's very practical questions of, I've studied this, I want to study that, how do I make that transition? So yeah, it would be great if you're available later on to cover any questions on SKEs. You do keep your mind on your GCSE grades, and you, generally speaking, need to get GCSE grades of English and Maths at grade C as a minimum, and if you're studying primary school, you also need to get science. Okay. And lastly, you need a DBS check, or disclosed and value service check, for anyone who works with children or vulnerable adults. That's just a standard part of checks that you would need to go through. So when you are a newly qualified teacher, once you've actually obtained your qualifications, you will, in the first instance, you will be awarded QTS, Qualified Teacher Status. That's so if you did a 1-year teacher training course at university with placement, which is known often as PGCE, you leave that course with Qualified Teacher Status, but in simple terms, you're not a qualified teacher yet. Okay, even though you've got Qualified Teacher Status, you have to then go on and do an induction year to become a fully qualified teacher. So it's a year of on-the-job supervised practice. Okay, you're still working as a teacher, you're still being paid, but you'll be on a more junior pay scale as a QTS teacher, and you will then ultimately go on to get to become a fully qualified teacher in QT. If you want to find out more, because obviously I'm just skimming the surface of this particular subject, the best way to do that is to, in the first instance, is just simply to do, as the screen is saying there, which is to go onto a website called Prospects and just Google how to become a teacher, and it will go into a lot more depth than the information that I've done there, just about those basics of you know, the kind of different types of sorry, of a school, and just some of the basics about the routes to how you become a teacher. So I'm going to look at the first now of the different routes into teaching, and I will go through some of these particular slides quite quickly, but again, there will always be the link to, if you want to find out more, this is how you get that extra bit of information. So if you want to become an early years teacher, which is teaching children up to the age of 5, you might want to you know, if your motivation for doing that might be very similar to the things that we've mentioned already. It might be about inspiring children at a very early stage of the development. And I think a lot of theory says how critical this particular stage is when a child is making that transition into primary school. That great start in education can be so critical and be so relevant even when pupils progress to degree level. That, you know, that good start is so important. So some people are very motivated to want to work at this age range because it is such a fantastic foundation for your well, for anybody's educational journey, really. If you want to work with in the early years range, I think at least one of our participants today has worked in that age range, just because we had a very short chat right at the beginning. It's going to be quite different working in that age range to, say, working in a secondary school. I think it's going to have many things in common. It's also going to be quite different. So these are just some of the little things to think about if you're working with that age range. Okay, you're generally going to be working in a team with other childcare professionals. You constantly need to have energy, creativity, enthusiasm, and you know, it can affect your home life, as all elements of teaching can, because there will quite often be work outside of, well, certainly work outside of core teaching hours, but that can ultimately mean things like taking work home. And you know, there are options, as there are with most teaching opportunities, to actually do self-employment and freelance work. And an obvious example of that is people who work as supply teachers. So some people, and this applies to all levels, will feel that that gives them a good work-life balance, that they can maybe decline or accept work based on potentially doing that while they've got their own business that they're running, but they're doing some teaching as a bit of a sort of sideline. So, and generally speaking, if you're working in this kind of early years work, you're not really doing much travel during the day. You're generally reporting to a fairly, you know, one place of work, or you might work over a couple of sites within the same school. So if you're wanting to be an early years teacher, you can do a specialist qualification to become an early years teacher, to teach at the early years teaching, EYTS. I'm just remembering early years teaching. I'm trying to remember what the S stands for. Laura, or what does the S stand for? Early years teaching specialist, from my memory. Early years teaching specialist, remember what the S stands for?
Yeah, sorry, Lee, it's one of those, isn't it, that you always just say the acronym and then forget the S.
EYTS, and I just went, which one is it? It's
one second, I'll get it for you.
Okay, I'm sure it's specialist. EYTS. So you can do a specialist qualification in that. Now, I'm not good, because there's so much information there on the screen, I'm not going to go through it all. But it's worthwhile saying that if you do this particular teaching qualification, it's status, thanks very much, not specialist, it's status, early years teaching status. Thank you, Laura. It does restrict you, if you do this qualification, to mean that you can only teach younger age children. So for someone who sees their, you know, long-term working career working with this age range, it could be that doing an EYTS qualification is completely appropriate, but it only allows you to work with children up to 5 years old. Okay, so it has a limitation to it, as well as an advantage that you're more specialist working with an age range. If you want to find out more, because it does cross over with what we're going to talk about next, just as you will find with all the sections of information I'm going through, just do exactly the same. Prospects, early years teacher job profile. That will take you through to the article where there's a lot more information and detail about it. But it does cross over very much with being a primary school teacher. So again, just in terms of what might motivate someone or some of the basics of being a primary school teacher, you're likely to develop lesson plans, and you develop those lesson plans in line with curriculum objectives. So this is what you need to achieve, and then you need to plan your lessons and your delivery to meet those objectives. You again need, particular skill set and ability to relate to children depending on their age and ability and aptitude. And you need to assess and record progress for students, because ultimately you're working towards SATs and preparing students for things like for national tests. So, much in common with being an early years teacher, but it does, as you're working with older age ranges, there does start to become a different emphasis in your work as you start to work with different age ranges. And that theme will be the same as we move up through the age ranges going into secondary and further education. So again, what to expect? Well, you generally have your own classroom, not absolutely in every single case, but that's quite common within primary school teaching. You've got that geographical flexibility that was mentioned in the chat. There are lots, and there are literally thousands of primary schools up and down the country. I don't know the exact number, but there's a lot. Even in one town, there'll be many different primary schools, but some schools may or may not have a nursery. Some schools may or may not have more dedicated special needs provision or be a specialist school. So there can be some variation on that. And a very high proportion of primary school teachers are women. So and increasing numbers of women now hold senior posts. It's just I just simply present the information as that's how it is, but it's quite dominated by female rather than male staff. You get occasional trips with pupils, so a little bit more flexibility. You might get out the school occasionally. My daughter's at a primary school, and we get they're going on a trip to the library or they're going to a park. It's not every week, but it's occasional. Okay, that might involve something like staying away from home, but it's rare, and it's probably more likely to be annual than anything more regular than that. So qualifications, what do you need? Well, you're going to find that a lot of this is very similar as we move through the different qualifications level. But what you need is, again, qualified teacher status. That's the standard that you need. But giving away the answer to the question that I asked you all earlier on about whether you needed a qualification or you didn't, independent schools and academies are permitted to employ teachers without QTS, but in practice this is uncommon. So when I asked people earlier on for a yes or no answer whether you needed a teaching qualification, the answer is no, because one of the sectors that can employ people without a teaching qualifications is independent schools. So a good example of this would be, and if you're thinking, well, why would they do that? What's in it for the school to recruit somebody without a teaching qualification? If, for example, some music is a really good example. Somebody could be an expert musician, lots of qualifications within music exams. They're not a teacher, but they've actually been teaching people as part of working in music and teaching people. They're not a sort of classroom teacher or a QTS qualified teacher. A private school might think, they will be willing to sort of let go of the idea of a qualified teacher to get the specialist skills of music that somebody might have. So that's just one situation. So I think the rule of thumb would be, unless you're very well connected or you've got very specialist skills, they're likely to want a teaching qualification. But you know, it does happen. There are people in independent schools without teaching qualifications, and also in academies. Because I haven't put it on the slide, but academies do have flexibility as well to recruit people without teaching qualifications. Primary teaching is open to all graduates, but a degree in a curriculum subject, e.g., as I put on the screen there, English, science or maths, increases your chances. But generally speaking, it's open to all graduates because you teach across the curriculum. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the information there on the screen about primary teaching, but just the very basics. Again, I'm going to point you where you can find out more information next. There is an assessment only route into teaching for people, generally speaking, who are already working in schools, who don't have qualified teacher status. So perhaps they're working as a teaching assistant, or they're working in that private school in a teaching role, but they've not got a qualification. But what I'd like to really do is flag up that link there about get into teaching, the more information link. Thanks very much, Laura. There's the website there in the chat. If you're wanting to find anything and everything out about teaching, it's a really good place to start, other than the resources that I'm now directing you to. Then the resource, but I just think that these resources on prospects, and again, same as before, primary school teacher, job profile, it will, if you Google that exact terminology there, it will take you directly to the information and a lot more depth about how you become a primary school teacher. So secondary, moving up the age ranges a little bit further. And again, you'll find that a lot is similar, but with some differences again in. So again, in terms of, you know, why you might become a secondary school teacher, thanks Laura again, you know, again, this is about a bit more about specializing now. It is possible, by the way, to be a specialist within primary. That is an option which has started to open up more over the last few years, is to become, you know, a specialist PE teacher, or a specialist music teacher, or a specialist arts teacher, and even that being within primary. But most primary school teachers teach, which is why they insist on the maths, English and science GCSE grades at 4 or C or above, because you teach across the curriculum. But secondary school teachers, as your own memories will probably no doubt tell you, generally speaking, teach in 1 or 2 or so different specialist subjects. Okay, and that's obviously might be where your particular degree or your passion or your interest is, a subject that you love. You know, again, you support, you observe, you record, you're working with the age range, which is put on the screen there, which is 11 to 18. And, you know, it is about keeping up with developments in your subject area. So rather than that broad-based role at primary level, as I said, as a generalization, you are, you know, you generally, you know, need to be more of a specialist. So what to expect? Very similar to primary, but with some differences. Again, subtle differences as the settings change. So again, you know, extra hours, you know, parents' evenings, these aren't unique to secondary, but maybe the volume of them is that little bit higher. Ofsted inspections aren't unique again, as are, you know, as are breakfast clubs, after schools clubs, sports drama and field trips, again, also apply to primary. You've got geographical mobility, jobs in every area, again, a bit less obviously in terms of secondary schools and primary schools, a bit less flexibility actually, because there's just less of them, because they're bigger generally than most primary schools, but you know, there are pretty much jobs in all areas. Don't necessarily have a classroom base in the same way as a primary school teacher. That's an important distinction for people who do very much like that kind of set place and a tray and a filing cabinet and everything where it's easily accessible in a room that they work from. You know, more often than not in a secondary school, you kind of move around multiple different classrooms, and that is quite a distinction. And that's usually just based on scale. and the fact that you're a specialist rather than a generalist teacher. And again, you know, as with primary, you know, trips staying away from home is occasional, but not necessarily the norm, but, you know, perhaps a little bit more common than in primary school, just because of the age range that you teach you. So again, just to focus on the qualifications, you know, teacher training is, again, very similar to what we went through before with primary, but with a couple of small differences. You have, you are looking at GCSE grade 4 or above, or GCSE grade C or above, but in maths and English rather than just maths, English and science. So strangely slightly lower criteria GCSE wise than primary, which is from one level slightly counterintuitive as you're teaching at a higher level, but it's back to that you're teaching at a broad spectrum. At primary, you're teaching more specialist, so maybe science isn't as relevant, you know, not for the students listening today, but I'm just talking, and generally science isn't necessarily as crucial if you're an arts teacher in a secondary school, for example, so there's more flex on it in secondary school. And again, just as in primary schools, independent schools and academies can recruit people without qualified teacher status, but again, it's rare, but it does happen. So generally speaking, if you're looking to become a teacher, you would do a postgraduate qualification that leads to qualified teacher status. So one of the things that often confuses people, and rightly so, by the way, is that people will talk very commonly about a PGCE. They'll say, oh, I'm going to do a PGCE, and what they believe is, and PGCE stands for Postgraduate Certificate in Education, and they think that is the bit that you need to become a teacher. You actually really need the qualification, which is QTS, Qualified Teacher Status. So the PGC is academic qualification, which you get awarded when you do a teacher training course. But actually, what's built into the course is the QTS component, the Qualified Teacher Status part. So if you like, you're getting two qualifications built into one. So people are often attracted to the title of Postgraduate Certificate in Education because you're looking at a master's level qualification, a level 7 qualification. But actually, the bit that you need to become a teacher is the QTS. Okay, so I'll move on from, because I'm looking at time and realize I need to pick up the pace a little bit to make sure we get plenty of time for questions. But what I will do is just to give you a very quick view there of some of the current priority subjects that schools are looking to recruit, or rather the government on behalf of schools are looking to recruit people to teach in. But you know, if the subject you're thinking of isn't listed on there, that doesn't mean you can't become a teacher, and it's just meaning that those are currently some of the priority areas where they're not necessarily attracting enough people into teaching those subjects. And just a last kind of shout out really is that teachers must pass national skills tests in literacy and numeracy before starting your teaching. This dates back many years, probably about 15 plus years ago. Hi Laura, did you want to just say something?
Oh yeah, there's just been an update for applications 2021 on the national skills tests.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's no longer a requirement. There is a good, there is a good article that the University of Cumbria have published. If you want me to pop the link in the chat for that, but yeah,
you would do. Thank you very much.
It's actually, sorry, I just because it has been one of those traditional requirements that has always been there for the national skills test prior to your teacher training. But yeah, they've decided to remove that, and actually, it's a benchmark now that they will assess your literacy and numeracy during your teacher training, so it's not an actual test beforehand. But I'll pop that link to the article in the chat.
Thank you very much, Laura. Cheers. Well, I think Laura's brings good news there, so that anything where you don't have to pass any additional tests is usually a good thing. But I was just about to say, and it's irrelevant now, that those dated back to concerns that that teachers didn't have some of the basics before they went and became teachers. You know, they needed to have mastery of those basic maths, English, and science skills. It looks like things have moved on a little bit from that as well. If you want to find out more, and probably the article I'm directing you to will be that bit out of date now, because you've got that updated information that's coming there in the chat. But if you do want to find out more, again, go to prospects, secondary school teacher, same drill as before, and you should be able to get a lot more information and the basics really about how you train to become a secondary teacher. So moving on to FE. Now, FE is quite different. Okay, so what we've looked at so far is early years, primary, secondary. There's been some differences, but there's also been a huge amount of similarity between some of those different training routes into those jobs. More in common than not in common. When you get to further education, it's quite different in very simple terms. So FE lecturers, as it says there, will teach really any students over the age of 14. So obviously sometimes there are students 14 and above who go to into FE college spaces and are taught. So it's generally 16, but it can actually also be 14 upwards in some situations. You would teach vocational subjects such as apprenticeships. You might teach more academic qualifications. You might also teach things like English and maths or basic skills such as English for speakers of other language. Okay, so people who are familiar with further education colleges know there's quite a huge variety of subjects and breadth, but generally more vocational, work related, in other words, that you would teach within further education. And you can teach really in FE in any of these different settings which I've put on the screen, where you're teaching people at that level. So they're fundamentally usually between level 1 and level 3. Certainly not usually any higher than level 3. However, you will sometimes find that for some further education colleges have got higher education courses, such as a foundation degree that they run. So occasionally you'll find that people will end up teaching on sort of higher level courses, such as, you know, equivalent to the first year of university, level 4, or even higher than that. But generally speaking, this just gives you an idea of some of the settings that you might teach in at FE level. So what to expect? In simple terms, it's quite different. It's a lot more, you know, a lot more similar to university than perhaps it is to school. So, you know, yeah, largely classroom, but it could also be in a workshop or a laboratory. It could also be even with employer premises. So if you're working in further education, you might be assessing an apprentice that's with an employer, and you're actually going out to an employer's premises to assess that student and their progress and the qualifications, usually MVQs or something similar they're working towards. Lots of jobs, but a lot of people working further education start off on what we call a sessional basis, part-time. So in other words, casual hours, maybe 6 or 4 hours a week. They might do it as a second job or in the evening on top of another job or experience that they've got. So in terms of qualifications, this is when it gets quite different for further education. So the first thing to flag up is a lot of people who teach in further education don't have teaching qualifications. In simple terms, they're specialists. So if they teach motor vehicle mechanic, be it a motor vehicle mechanic lecturer, for example, in a further education college, you know, they've probably had a career as a motor vehicle mechanic or MOT testing station or whatever it might be, or something in engineering. Okay, so a lot of people come into further education lecturing depending on the subject from industry, and they're a subject specialist first, I suppose, and a teacher second. So that's a simple way to think of it. But there's also people who work in further education who, you know, sometimes are subject specialists. They might have a PhD, they might have high-level qualifications, they might have a degree, they might have been able to gain some teaching experience through different means, and sometimes people are able to get jobs by being a specialist without, you know, an academic specialist, and able to teach in these spaces as well. There are various qualifications which I've put a list on the page there that you can do. They're quite different types of qualifications, quite a variety. Those are some of the main titles that I've listed there on the screen between level 3 and level 5. But a lot of people will do these qualifications once they've actually got some level of employment within a further education college. So they might do some of these, but some of these qualifications require you to reflect on the experience that you're gaining through work. So they'll say, you know, that need you to have that reflection. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg one with this, is that it can be a tough one, and maybe one for some individual guidance, because you kind of need both experience and a qualification, and it's about thinking about the order in which you tackle this. So if you're a subject specialist, you might be able to get a job in further education on the strength of your subject specialist. If you're more of an academic specialist, then you know, you also might be able to get a job that way as well. But really what you want is a combination of them both. Okay, so that's hard to explain, but it's something, maybe it's a case of sometimes looking at an individual, what their current experience is, and then plotting an individual route to how you can work in FE. It is possible to do a PGCE, which we're going to talk about in a bit more depth in a minute, in post-compulsory education. So that's been mentioned within early years, primary and secondary, as almost being one of the most common ways into teaching. And you can do one of those qualifications in further education lecturing, or to use its exact title, post-compulsory education. So as much as that, I'll just go back a slide, as much as you can do these qualifications here on the screen, and sometimes you can sign up for some of these without necessarily having teaching experience. You can also get you can also do a PGCE rather than a PGCE, as opposed to a P. Can I get the right words right? PGCE. It's in simple terms, it's very similar structure that's available in further education than there is in primary, in secondary. So there is the option for this more traditional qualification as a way in, or through an experience route, or through some of those other qualifications. So it's not as straightforward, this one, in terms of planning a route into it. Therefore, my best advice for people, if you are strongly thinking of this area, is to contact the FE advice line, which is you know, because it is complex, or to book in to see an advisor such as myself or Laura for some individual support with this area, because there are a number of permutations and routes into this type of work. Thank you, Laura, for posting the link there in the chat. Again, as before, you can find out more on the Prospects Further Education teaching job profile, as in with all the other areas of work. So we've covered now a little bit about, you know, what a teacher does, what some of the skills are for teaching, and we've gone really quite, you know, at least the surface of the different age ranges, some of the differences, but what we've not covered up to this point is the information about how you actually get into teaching. What do the qualifications include? So the basics are, if you decide to go into teaching, as mentioned before, you need a 2-2. If you do a teaching program, all teaching programs will always include 120 days of practical classroom experience. In other words, you can't learn about how to become a teacher without experiencing having practical classroom experience. It's not something, so even if you do a PGCE, it's not an academic only course, it's an academic course with 120 days of practical classroom experience built in. Okay, you will experience things like ongoing assessment, professional mentoring, and you will need to kind of, continue with academic study to give you the knowledge you need to teach successfully. And it's a really good starting point into teaching is to volunteer. That's what we often say to people, particularly if you are considering different age ranges, so that you're not certain whether it's primary or secondary or FE or early years or primary. It's a good idea to think, to start off with doing some volunteering. And in very simple terms, we will often simply advise people to go back to their primary school, to go back to their secondary school, to think of contacts that they've got, someone they know who's a teacher. Think about your contacts and your network for someone that you could ask. Schools are used to giving people experience. It's not uncommon. They will usually be responsive, and sometimes it's simply a trip to the office of that school for a chat with, hopefully a friendly receptionist who will be able to then give you the heads up on how likely they are to recruit, when they're likely to take somebody on, because schools need volunteers. It's just very, very simple. Teachers are very grateful for people who can support with things like creating, beautiful display boards, some of the tidying, some of the basics of classrooms that you need, and in return for some of that support, they're able to give you some experience and observation of lessons. So do think about volunteering in schools as a good starting point if you're interested in teaching. We've covered already quite a bit about the PGCE, but in very simple terms, it's a one-year course. It's what most people think of when they think about teaching, a one-year course, and it's got that built-in work experience as part of it. Okay. Thanks very much, Claire. Let's bring that in the chat. You can also request school experience through the government website. So yes, that's another way. So other than the ways that I mentioned before about using your contacts and direct approach to school, there's a formal system of requesting it through that website. My personal suggestion would be to stick with the informal. I think you can get some great experience if you have got the contacts, but not everybody has or feels comfortable approaching, for example, their old primary school. Maybe people don't have happy memories of that, or just don't want to do it for whatever reason. So if you've not got that contacts and networks, or a little bit reluctant to approach, please feel free to use the school experience link that Claire's put there in the chat. So again, I'm conscious that I have a lot to get through and I probably need to pick up the pace, but what's the difference between a led and a university-led PGCE? I'm not going to cover this just at the moment, but you've got the slides and there's a little bit of information and there's a chance to look into that matter in a little bit more detail later on. But these are some of the organizations that can support you in terms of teaching. So there's Now Teach, which is about helping people who are already experienced at I've got some teaching experience to retrain as teachers. That one's called Now Teach. I've got Premier Pathways, which is about a 2-year training program for graduates who need a minimum 2-1 or above. There's something called Researchers in Schools, and it's a salaried teacher training program. So a lot of teacher training programs are not salaried. But this is available to people who have done a PhD or a doctorate in this case, and people who are interested specifically in research. And as I said, because of time, I just need to pick up a little bit of the pace on the slides. But if you've got, we'll circulate these slides afterwards if you need to find out more. Now, Teach First, another organization. I will just spend a bit longer on Teach First because it's not that well known about. But Teach First is a charity. Again, another training route that you need to have a 2-1 or above. A 2-year development program, and you actually apply for this in a different way than you apply for most other teaching programs. And we'll talk about how you apply later, but Teach First has its own separate application route, which is distinct from the other different training routes. So just something to flag up, and you do need a 2-1. The easiest way to describe Teach First is you would usually do, it's a bit more of a boot camp style teacher training route. You do, I think it's a 6-week course during the summer to boot camp style, you know, very much giving you all the basics that you need to be a teacher. And then in the September, you're in a school and you're teaching and you're salaried. It's a fast track way of, you know, rather than a more gentle 1-year placements, it's more of a, you know, more of a 6 weeks basics, equip you straight in the classroom in the September. So it's a little bit more sink or swim, this model, and that's why they insist on the higher kind of level qualifications, but they're looking very much at aspiring leaders and people that they can train and develop and move into leadership roles. So it's very appealing, particularly because it's salaried pretty much from day one that you do this program. You can also teach without a degree, and we've covered this already within some of the things that we've talked about and some of the questions that have come up. And it's particularly in things like private schools and academies, where they're able to recruit without a degree. But if you want to find out more, again, as with all the other sections, please click on prospects, routes into teaching, and that will take you through to you know, a greater depth of information than I've been able to go through, particularly some of those different programs like Teach First and what they're all about, you know, will be contained in that article. So, subject knowledge enhancement courses, which again are terminology that we've touched on already. So a subject knowledge enhancement course is, in simple terms, if the subject that you want to teach in doesn't quite fit, as mentioned earlier on, with the subject that you studied at degree. So if there's a mismatch between what you want to teach and your experience, it's possible that you could do a subject knowledge enhancement course. Okay, they're offered in some of the subjects that I've put there on the screen, and there's a specific subject knowledge enhancement course search tool which you can use. In the slides when you get the presentation, these are live links, so you can simply click on the links within the presentation, but Collaborate being as it is, it's not that great at showing us links as live things. But you can sort of, those are examples of subjects that you can do. Okay, I can't remember if Laura or Claire wants to shout out. I'm just trying to remember how long typically SKEs are. They're not short courses, aren't they?
Well, they can depend. So depending on what your subject requirement is, they can be really short. They can be sort of an 8-week part-time thing, or they can be kind of a full-time 6-month course. So it kind of depends on what you're going from and to, and what your current level of study is.
Thank you very much. Yeah, cheers. Thank you. So yeah, so you know, as many things are within careers and pathways, you know, it depends. But just give you an idea that it's not necessarily a full year, one year program, like some of the other things that we're talking about. You know, it depends on, you know, how much of a mismatch, I suppose, in many respects between your degree and what it is that you want to study. Information again on there about the different subject knowledge enhancement course providers. They're provided by lots and lots of different centres up and down the country, so it's possible to, you know, find something that's convenient as a location to study one if you need one. And again, prospects being very helpful as they always are, write a nice article on subject knowledge enhancement courses, where again it just gives you the basic, but most crucially all the links off that article to go to that bit more of a deep dive in terms of your research and the steps that you need to take if that's something you feel you need for, you know, your ambitions within teaching. So moving on now to the application process, because I do want to build in enough time just to kind of open it up for questions in the last quarter of an hour. It's changed. The easiest thing to say straight away is the application process for teacher training this year is going to go through the biggest change in a very long time. So UCAS have always dominated and been the main portal to apply for teacher training. But now from September, UCAS are no longer going to be used for teacher training applications, and it's going to be done directly through the website that's on there, the Apply for Teacher Training website. Like many things, such as renewing your car tax or registering for a national insurance number, it's done through the gov.uk portal. But what I will spend just a couple of minutes on is the basics of how the application process works. So when you apply to university, sorry, to a teacher training, you can, if you apply in usually a date in October, I haven't had it confirmed what it's going to be for 2021 yet, you would normally apply for 3 different choices. So those can be a mix of different types of teacher training. So one could be a PGCE in a university. One could be a teaching training program based in a school, such as SCIT, School Centred Initial Teacher Training. One could be an apprenticeship in teaching, or one could be something called Schools Direct. There are lots of different flavours of teacher training, and the easiest way I could explain that would be to say that the main choices would be in 2 categories. One would be some kind of work-based route into teacher training, such as SCIT, Schools Direct, initial schools, those kind of routes, and apprenticeships. So they are ones where you would go into a classroom and learn while you're teaching, as well as things like Teach First was another example of that. Or you apply to a university for a PGCE rather than to an employer, and the PGCE you kind of start off in a classroom but then go out on work placement. So you can apply for a mixture of different training routes, and you can apply for up to 3 choices. So that's like your first stage of the application process. But if you're unsuccessful with any of those 3 applications, you can then do something which they are going to call, used to be called Apply To on UCAS, and is now going to be called Apply Again. So that means if you're unsuccessful with any of your applications, you can have another go, but this time you apply just for one course provider or teaching training provider at a time. It's a little bit like clearing in a way. When people are applying to university at undergrad, you might apply for up to 5 unis. If you're not successful or decline all your offers, you then might go through clearing, apply 1 at a time, or add an extra choice at a time. So it's a bit similar to that. Okay, but that's just the real basics of the application process. There's quite a few bits of unknowns about it so far, but the best thing to do is to, just going back a stage, is to go to the web link there that I think Laura has just handily posted, the Apply for Teacher Training link, which will kind of give you the basics of what you need to know in terms of the application. Just a quick heads up about the deadline for teacher training. You are generally speaking looking at applying in usually the September-October time, in advance of the year that you want to start teaching. So so generally speaking, you could apply anything up to a year before, so it can be as early as that. So my suggested timeline would be approximately about 11 months before you are actually due to start teaching. It's as early as that. You can apply later, and sometimes quite late and very late, but ideally we would say quite early on. And again, you can find all this information out by searching on the terminology that's there on the screen. Applying for teacher training. So lastly, just to finish up with, funding is a huge topic. It's not possible to do it justice within the time, or because it's such a broad session that we're covering today. But the kind of very simple advice is there are bursaries available, but it depends. It depends on a number of different factors. So it depends on the type of training that you're doing. whether you're doing something like a PGCE or you're doing a salaried route, such as Teach First. I mentioned that one. That is a salaried route. You can sometimes get, there might be funding available, but it all depends sometimes on the subject that you're studying and the mode of teacher training that you're doing. And as it says there, and it also matters slightly on your personal circumstances and where you plan to study as well. Okay, but if you are wanting to find out more about funding, it's worthwhile going again to that link, because you'll be able to kind of drill into a lot more depth about the different routes in different funding options that are available. So that's it really. Apologies, I've just had to pick up the pace a little bit towards the end. I was a bit conscious of time, but I'd love people now to shout out some questions. Is there anything, Claire and Laura, that you just think it might be useful for me to bring up, or to just clarify? There's a couple that I'm happy to just think I've not really emphasized enough for my own liking. So just any feedback from both of you?
No, I think it's just exactly as you were saying, Lee. I mean, I think, when you're concentrating on the secondary, primary or further education, it's then really that you can really drum down. It does get so confusing when you're talking about all of them, a mixture of all of them. But I think that was a great overview, really. And obviously the links are there for you to, as we say, drum down into your specifics. So hopefully it was useful for them.
Yeah. Are there any questions from anyone? We would love to ask you. We've got a few minutes. I think it was, at least we've got at least 7 minutes, and we've got enough time to answer any questions that people have. One thing I'm conscious I didn't spend a lot of time on was about some of the differences between doing a work-based route and doing a university-based route. Does anybody else feel that that might be useful for me to just go into in a bit more depth? Okay, so just to kind of just pick up on a couple of things, but I'm more than happy. Please do shout your questions out. Use the mic, use the chat, whatever, or just, if you need to book an individual appointment, that, we've got our contact details there on the screen, to let you know how to contact us, including the old-fashioned way of just ringing us up, and that's absolutely fine as well. We still find quite a lot of students just call us actually, or just navigate through to our Careers and Enterprise webpage on Student Hub and access us that way, whatever's the most convenient way of contacting us. But if it's created questions for you listening to me today, do kind of contact us. I'll just finish up on a little bit about the difference between the work-based routes and the university-based routes. As I mentioned earlier on, a lot of people will know the phrase PGCE. Yeah. Oh, sorry, there's a question there from Oliver. Can you apply for Teach First and the university-based PGCE? The answer is yes. Okay, because Teach First have its own application system. It's separate, so you could apply on the government portal for 3 choices, and you could also apply for Teach First. So I'm happy to give you the good news there, Oliver, which is yes, you can do that. A lot of people think about the PGCE as the gold standard qualification that you need to become a teacher, but actually it's QTS, Qualified Teacher Status. So all of the teaching routes, be them an apprenticeship, SCIT, School-Centered Initial Teacher Training, Teach First, the Schools Direct, all sorts of different types of training scheme, they all will give you qualified teacher status. So that's the good news. But some of them will also give you the academic qualification of a PGCE, but not all. Okay, so there is some variation in whether you get 2 qualifications built into your teaching route or whether you just get 1. You also have to think about whether the differences in your learning style. That some people are very much, I'm itching to get into a classroom, I want to apply, I want to be teaching, that fits my learning style if I'm in a classroom. Other people feel more comfortable with the familiarity of starting off more in a university setting. But I don't know the exact number of weeks that you'll spend in a classroom before going out on placement, but I guess it's something like in the 6 weeks or so range. And then you would be in the basics and then on a placement, and then back into university, and then likely again onto another placement, which might mean that you get to experience more than one school through a placement. So that's another factor to consider that a PGC might give you versus a work-based route. But unfortunately, there are also some work-based routes where you have the option to work in more than one school as well. So it's quite a complex area between a PGCE, which you apply to a university for, and also applying, for a work-based route. And they're quite difficult options to weigh up. And all you need to do is just maybe do the research and the reading to reflect on what the right one for you is. But the good news is all the training routes will qualify you to be a teacher. Okay. So I'll finish up on that now. Any last questions? I'd love to take a last one, but if there's not, I think we'll call it a day. Shall we take Claire and Laura silence to be the end of the session?
Oh, you've got another one here. Oh, just about the recording.
I don't actually know the answer to that question, but it's a good question. I'll certainly record it. I'm not quite certain. It would be with the recordings for the other sessions, for all the other careers events it will be publicized to you in some way, but I will just check with my colleague who's been heavily involved in the organization, but how we actually access the recording. But I'll check that and come back to people. Is that okay? Oh, got last question. Does pedagogy have any relation to what is being said in the event? I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Does anybody else? Laura, do you understand the question to be able to answer, or is it just me? Or
I mean, I think that's because obviously the pedagogy, that's very, subject based and academic, the actual content. So that will be obviously heavily involved with the actual training side of building in all of your subject knowledge in order to deliver your lessons effectively, really. And I'm not too sure if that is answering the question, but I suppose, yeah, the underlying pedagogy of teaching, yeah, it falls into everything sort of that we have been saying. Of course, you're going to be trained in order to be able to bring that into your teaching profession, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The other thing I will say that it obviously links to is it links to being able to get through the selection process, because they will want to understand your philosophy of teaching.
Yeah.
It's one of the central things, why do you want to be a teacher? What makes a good teacher? Challenges of teaching, how do learners learn best? All of the kind of those different dynamics play out when it comes to the recruitment process and writing supporting statements. So it completely links. It's just, I think it's just, exactly in what context. We're a bit uncertain on the chat. Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much, everyone, taking part. I'll stop recording now, and thanks very much.